Episode 23. Why, you're not long-nosed, green-eyed, curly-haired, wide-mouthed, thick-necked, broad-shouldered, round-bodied, short-armed, bow-legged, or big-footed. And you're not at all frightening, said Milo indignantly. What kind of a demon are you? The little creature, who seemed stunned at being found out, leapt back out of sight and began to whimper softly.
"I'm the demon of insincerity," he sobbed. "I don't mean what I say, I don't mean what I do, and I don't mean what I am. Most people who believe what I tell them go the wrong way and stay there, but you and your awful telescope have spoiled everything. I'm going home."
And crying hysterically, he stamped off in a huff. It certainly pays to have a good look at things, observed Milo, as he wrapped up the telescope with great care. Now all we have to do is climb out, said Tock, placing his front paws as high on the wall as he could. Here, hop up on my back. Milo climbed onto the dog's shoulders. Then the bug crawled up both of them, and by standing on Milo's head, just managed to hook his cane on the root of an old gnarled tree. With loud complaints, he hung on doggedly until the other two had climbed out over him and pulled him up, somewhat dazed and discouraged.
"I'll lead the way for a while," he said, brushing himself off. "Follow me, and we'll stay out of trouble."
He guided them along one of 5 narrow ledges, all of which led to a grooved and rutted plateau. They stopped for a moment to rest and make plans, but before they had done either one, the whole mountain trembled violently, and with a sudden lurch rose high into the air, carrying them along with it, for quite accidentally they had stepped into the calloused hand of the gelatinous giant.
"And what have we here?" he roared,
looking curiously at the tiny figures in his palm and licking his lips. He was an incredible size, even sitting down, with long, unkempt hair, bulging eyes, and a shape hardly worth speaking of. He looked, in fact, very much like a colossal bowl of jelly, without the bowl.
"How dare you disturb my nap!"
he bellowed furiously, and the force of his hot breath tumbled them over in his hand. "We're terribly sorry," said Milo meekly when he'd untangled himself, "but you looked just like part of the mountain."
"Naturally,"
the giant replied in a more normal voice, but even this was like an explosion.
"I have no shape of my own, so I try to be just like whatever I'm near. In the mountains, I'm a lofty peak. On the beach, a broad sandbar. In the forest, a towering oak, and sometimes in the city, I'm a very handsome 12-story apartment house. I just hate to be conspicuous. It's really not safe, you know."
Then he looked at them again with hungry eyes and wondered how well they'd taste. "You look much too big to be afraid of anything," said Milo quickly, for the giant had already begun to open his mouth wide.
"I'm not,"
he said, with a slight shiver that ran all over his gelatinous body.
"I'm afraid of everything. That's why I'm so ferocious. If the others found out, I'd just die. Now do be quiet while I eat my breakfast."
He raised his hand toward his gaping mouth, and the humbug shut his eyes tightly and clasped both hands over his head. "Then aren't you really a fearful demon?" Milo asked desperately, on the assumption that the giant had been brought up well enough not to talk with a mouthful.
"Well, approximately, yes," he replied, lowering his arm to the vast relief of the bug. "That is, comparatively, no. What I mean is relatively, maybe. In other words, roughly, perhaps. What does everyone else think? There, You see, he said peevishly, I'm even afraid to make a positive statement, so please stop asking questions before I lose my appetite altogether.
Then he raised his arm again and prepared to swallow the three of them in one gulp. Well, why don't you help us rescue Rhyme and Reason? Then maybe things will get better, shouted Milo again, this time almost too late, for in another instant they would have all been gone.
Oh, I wouldn't do that,
said the giant thoughtfully, lowering his arm once more.
I mean, why not leave well enough alone? That is, it'll never work. I wouldn't take a chance. In other words, let's keep things as they are. Changes are so frightening.
As he spoke, he began to look a little ill.
Maybe I'll just eat one of you, he remarked unhappily, and save the rest for later. I don't feel very well.
I have a better idea, said Milo.
You do?
Interrupted the giant, losing any desire to eat at all.
If it's one thing I can't swallow, it's ideas. They're so hard to digest.
I have a box full of all the ideas in the world, said Milo, proudly holding up the gift King Azaz had given him. The thought of it terrified the giant, who began to shake like an enormous pudding.
Put me down and just go away, he pleaded,
forgetting for a moment who had hold of whom.
And please don't open that box.
In another moment, he'd set them down on the next jagged peak, and with panic in his eyes, lumbered off to warn the others of this terrible new threat. But news travelled quickly. The word-snatcher, the trivium, and the long-nosed, green-eyed, curly-haired, wide-mouthed, thick-necked, broad-shouldered, round-bodied, short-armed, bow-legged, big-footed monster had already spread the alarm throughout the evil, unenlightened mountains. And out the demons came, from every cave and crevice, through every fissure and crack, from under the rocks and up from the mud, stomping and shuffling, slithering and sliding through the murky shadows. And all had only one thought in mind: destroy the intruders and protect ignorance. From where they stood, Milo, Talk, and the humbug could see them moving steadily forward, still far away but coming quickly. On all sides the cliffs were alive with this evil collection of crawling, looming, creeping, lurching shapes. Some could be seen plainly. Others were but dim silhouettes, and yet still more, only now beginning to stir from their foul places, would be along much sooner than they were wanted.
"We'd better hurry," barked Talk, "or they're sure to catch us."
And he started up the trail again. Milo took one deep breath and did the same, and the bug, now that he knew what lay behind, ran ahead with renewed enthusiasm. Chapter 18. Castle in the Air. Higher and higher they climbed in search of the castle and the two banished princesses. From one crest to the next, from jagged rock to jagged rock, up frightful crumbling cliffs and along desperately narrow ledges where a single misstep meant only goodbye. An ominous silence dropped like a curtain around them, and except for the scuffling of their frantic footsteps, there wasn't a sound. The world that Milo knew was a million thoughts away, and the demons were there, in the distance.
"They're gaining!"
shouted the humbug, wishing he'd never looked back. "But there it is!" cried Milo at the same instant, for straight ahead, climbing up from atop the highest peak, was a spidery spiral stair, and at the other end stood the castle in the air.
"I see it! I see it!"
said the happy bug as they struggled up the twisting mountain trail. But what he didn't see was that curled up right in front of the first step was a little round man in a frock coat, sleeping peacefully on a very large and well-worn ledger. A long quill pen sat precariously behind his ear. There were ink stains all over his hands and face as well as his clothing, and he wore a pair of the thickest eyeglasses that Milo had ever seen.
Be very careful,
whispered Talk when they'd finally reached the top, and the humbug stepped gingerly around and started up the stairs.
Names?
The little man called out briskly, just as the startled bug reached the first step. He sat up quickly, pulled the book out from under him, put on a green eye shade, and waited with his pen poised in the air.
Well, I...
stammered the bug.
Names?
He cried again, and as he did, he opened the book to page 512 and began to write furiously. The quill made horrible scratching noises, and the point, which was continually catching in the paper, flicked tiny ink blots all over him. As they called out their names, he noted them carefully in alphabetical order.
Splendid, 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 he muttered to himself. I haven't had an M in ages.
What do you want our names for? Asked Milo, looking anxiously over his shoulder. We're in a bit of a hurry.
Oh, this won't take a minute, the man assured them. I'm the official census taker, and I must have some information before I can take your census. Now, if you'll just tell me where you were born, how old you are now, how old you were then, how old you'll be in a little while, your mother's name, your father's name, your aunt's name, your uncle's name, your cousin's name, where you live, how long you've lived there, the schools you've attended, the schools you haven't attended, your hobbies, your telephone number, your shoe size, shirt size, collar size, hat size, and the names and addresses of 6 people who can verify all this information. We'll get started. One at a time, please. Stand in line and no pushing, no talking, no peeking.